You are listening to Sandakan March to Oblivion, researched, written and narrated by Mark Felton. Episode 3. A second Sandakan Death March was begun in May 1945. On the 29th of May at 9 in the morning, Captain Takakura, Camp Commandant, accompanied by his adjutant and the quartermaster, inspected No. 1 Camp. By this stage, No. 1 Australian Camp was the camp still functioning out of the original 3. In April, British prisoners had been moved to a wired-off enclosure inside No. 1 Camp, and No. 2 British Camp was shut. No. 3 Australian Camp had also been shut after its occupants had been forced into the death marches to Roval. At 9:15 a.m., Takakura ordered Numbers 2 and 3 camps to be burned down and the nearby ammunition dumps to be destroyed. At 10:30, Takakura issued orders to clear No. 1 Camp of prisoners within 10 minutes, an order later extended to 20 minutes. The last sick POWs were carried out of the camp by their mates at 11 a.m, and then the guards set the buildings on fire. 800 Australian and British POWs were forced into the garden area in No. 2 Camp and left to sit in the open under guard until a parade was called at 6 p.m. The Japanese divided 536 of this number into columns of 4 and started them on their way to Roval through the main gate under a heavy guard, while the rest were left to sit among the smouldering ruins of the camps with little to eat and no hope of relief. The second Death March prisoners were in an even poorer physical shape than the first group of Australians who had left months before, and they began to die in huge numbers very quickly. For example, Group 2, which consisted of 50 men, lost 12 of their number on the very first day of the march. Captain Takakura was actually shot and wounded by one of his own guards during the march, the guard driven to this by the appalling sights he witnessed. The guard committed suicide after killing and wounding several of the Japanese headquarters detail. The Japanese adjutant at Sandakan, Lieutenant Watanabe, accompanied one of the marchers to Roval, during which about 90 Allied prisoners were executed. Watanabe later tried to justify the actions of his men. He stated that the prisoners were, quote, ill and were put out of their misery by being shot. They asked for death rather than be left behind, unquote. The handful of Australian prisoners who managed to escape from the death marches confirmed that Watanabe was lying to save his own neck from the gallows. The Japanese simply executed any man who could not go on. The vanguard of the second death march began to arrive in Roval 26 days after leaving Sandakan. 536 men had begun the trek, and 183 made it, 142 Australians and 41 British. The remaining 347 were killed by the Japanese. If blokes just couldn't go on, we shook hands with them and said, hope everything's all right, recalled Private Nelson Short, the 2nd 18th Australian Battalion. But they knew what was going to happen. There was nothing you could do. You just had to keep yourself going. More or less survival of the fittest. At Roval, the Japanese continued to let POWs die from disease and starvation. However, they were conscious that they were committing war crimes and tried to force the fittest POWs to collude with them in concealing what was being done. Warrant Officer Stickbewich later testified that he was forced to make out death certificates for the POWs, and that a Japanese medical orderly who supervised the burial of the dead had told him that he had seen an order that all prisoners were to be killed. He had seen it in the hombu, the officers' quarters. He told Stickbewich to keep the information to himself. This information and a warning from another friendly guard encouraged Stickbewich and driver Ryther to escape on the 28th of July. Even in July 1945, the Allies could have saved a significant number of POWs. Inside the remains of the Sandakan camps were 288 Australian and British prisoners who were living in the open with minimal guard coverage. By mid-July, the Japanese officer in charge received an order to move any fit prisoners to Ranao. Most of these men were in such a bad way that they could not stand, but through a combination of hollow promises and brutality, the Japanese managed to assemble 75 men who could actually walk for the third death march. None of these prisoners managed to struggle more than 40 miles along the trail. The Japanese killed them all. The Japanese still had a few dozen Allied POWs who had remained alive among the ruins of the camps, and whose numbers were daily decreasing as disease and starvation killed them off. On the 13th of July, the Japanese rounded up 23 and took them to the nearby airfield. Captain Takakura ordered Sergeant Major Hisao Morozumi to dispose of them, and Morozumi and his men began their grim task. Recalled Private Yashitoro Goto. The firing party kept firing till there were no more signs of life. Then we dragged the bodies into a nearby air raid shelter and filled it in. A further 29 Australian and British prisoners were left to starve to death among the ruins of the camp, and by the time Japan surrendered on the 15th of August 1945, only one Australian prisoner was still alive. On the very day that the war finally ended, Sergeant Major Morozumi murdered this last survivor. The prisoner's legs were covered with ulcers, recalled Wong Hyong, a Chinese working at the airfield. He was a tall, thin, dark man with a long face and was naked apart from a loincloth. The prisoner was frog-marched over to a drain by 2 Japanese soldiers. Morozumi made the man kneel down and tied a black cloth over his eyes, recalled Wong. He did not say anything or make any protest. He was so weak that his hands were not tied. Morozumi cut his head off with one sword stroke. The Japanese then pushed the decapitated corpse into the drain where the soldier's head already lay. The other Japs threw in some dirt, covered the remains and returned to the camp, said Wong. Although the Japanese had killed all of the remaining prisoners at Sandakan, many had managed by a superhuman effort to reach Ranao. Here, the death rate among the remaining prisoners had reached 7 per day by July 1945. The Japanese forced them to labour. The POWs cut bamboo, collected wood and atap for the huts, and carried 20-kilo bags of food to Ranao from a Japanese supply dump nearly 2 miles away. The Japanese officers' quarters was kept supplied with fresh water by tottering gangs of emaciated prisoners who were forced to haul an average of 130 buckets full of water up a steep hill each day. The ration level was so low as to be virtually non-existent. They were given a small cup of rice water a day with about an inch of rice in the bottom, recalled Private Bottrill, who later managed to escape. Plenty of rice was available, and the Japanese used to get 800 grams a day themselves. They also used to get tapioca, meat, eggs and sweet potatoes, and showed no signs of malnutrition. The brutality of the Japanese guards towards their charges was undiminished. Sapper Arthur Bird of the Australian Engineers had survived the first forced march to Ranao. On the 7th of July, Bird was dragged out of a hut to work by a Japanese guard. Bird tried to explain that he was completely unfit for labour as he was suffering from beriberi, malaria and tropical leg ulcers. The guard's response was to kick Bird on the ground for 10 minutes until the emaciated Australian had lapsed into a coma. 2 days later, Sapper Bird died. Although Japan surrendered on the 15th of August, the killing at Ranao continued without let-up. On the 27th of August, 12 days after the Japanese surrender, the last 40 remaining POWs at Ranao were lined up and each shot in the back of the head. According to official records, 2,776 Australian and British prisoners had been brought to Sandakan in 3 large shipments as slave labourers. Only 6 survived, all of them Australian soldiers, and only because they had managed to escape and were sheltered and protected at great risk by local people and eventually handed over to the advancing Australian forces. The question that has been asked many times over the last 7 decades is why the Allies did not save the prisoners at Sandakan. A plan existed for their liberation, but the operation was never mounted, and over 2,700 men were effectively condemned to death, even though SWPA had been informed by SRD operatives who were on the ground in Borneo that the prisoners were in an awful condition, and that the Japanese were forcing them onto marches to Roval. It was long suspected, and indeed still is by some historians, that General MacArthur was ultimately behind the decision not to launch Operation Kingfisher, the planned rescue, and save the starving, diseased and abused POWs at Sandakan. MacArthur had given the highest priority to finding and freeing POWs and civilian internees, wrote Gavin Dawes in Prisoners of the Japanese, in the middle of large-scale fighting and with no expense spared, but that had been in the Philippines. It was part of the grand gesture of MacArthur returning, and the prisoners to be rescued were Americans. The POWs at Sandakan were many times the number at Cabanatuan and Bilibid, the main prison camps in the Philippines, but they were not Americans. Certainly, American forces on Luzon were better placed to liberate the prison camps to their immediate front, as it was a land-based campaign, whereas liberating Sandakan would have involved the use of airborne and naval forces. Dawes is one among many historians who have continued to defend the fiction that Kingfisher was never enacted because of General MacArthur only being interested in liberating American captives because of the propaganda value to himself. Some authors have maintained that MacArthur was therefore responsible for the deaths of thousands of Australian and British servicemen because he withheld the resources that could have been used to save them, and instead callously abandoned them to horrible deaths at the hands of the Japanese. Abandonment certainly plays a central role in the story of the Sandakan Death Marches, but the evidence now seems to point to the abandoning of the prisoners by the Australian authorities rather than MacArthur and the American-led SWPA. Australian researcher Lynette Ramsey Silver, author of what many see as the definitive work on the subject, Sandakan Conspiracy of Silence, as well as fellow writers Oei Kiat Jin and Alan Powell, have firmly placed the blame for Sandakan onto the Australians. The Australian Chief of Staff, General Sir Thomas Blamey, has been revealed as the root cause of the operation's failure as he dithered and prevaricated and made excuses for not involving Australian personnel in a rescue attempt. Blamey's reputation has been somewhat sullied when it is realised that he constantly pandered to MacArthur and SWPA, while failing to do anything on his own initiative that had the potential to upset the Americans. Sir Max Hastings has described Blamey as a conceited, corpulent, devious autocrat, 60 in 1944. This former teacher, lay preacher and First World War veteran had been sacked for corruption from his position of Commissioner of the Victoria Police in 1936, but had nonetheless been appointed as Australian Army Commander-in-Chief in 1939. Whilst he was deputy to General Sir Archibald Wavell in Greece in 1941, Blamey had been accused of cowardice by his own Chief of Staff. His contemporaries shared Hastings' evaluation of the man. Air Marshal Sir Arthur Tedder described Blamey as, quote, a rather unpleasant political soldier, a tubby little man with a snub nose and expensive complexion, high blood pressure and a scrubby little white moustache. General Sir Claude Auchinleck shared equally strong opinions of Blamey as Tedder. Quote, he wasn't a general I should have chosen to command an operation, he wrote. General Sir Alan Brooke, who often had his hands full trying to rein in the wilder ideas of Winston Churchill and Lord Mountbatten, called Blamey, quote, not an impressive specimen. He looks entirely drink-sodden and somewhat repulsive, unquote. Blamey was no more popular among his own people. Many Australians actively detested their nation's senior soldier. The Australian version of Britain's SOE, the Special Reconnaissance Department, or SRD, has also come in for heavy criticism over its handling of the intelligence that its operatives behind the lines in Borneo had gathered on the locations, condition and treatment of the Australian and British POWs. Undoubtedly, there was a cover-up at the highest levels over the failure to launch Kingfisher, especially when the huge numbers of prisoner deaths were revealed immediately after the Australian occupation of North Borneo. The fiction that many authors have bought into and promulgated in print is that MacArthur sealed the fate of Kingfisher by refusing to provide material support for the mission. This lie originated with General Blamey, when he stated that insufficient aircraft and ships were available to support Kingfisher, and that all Australian resources were dedicated to supporting MacArthur's final push on Japan. Advanced planning and preparations for Kingfisher were well underway when the operation was cancelled. In Australia, a parachute battalion under the command of Lieutenant Colonel John Overall had been in training specifically for Kingfisher. Their job was to drop over the Sandakan camps, take out the small numbers of Japanese guards, and liberate the prisoners. Blamey made it clear where the blame for the failure of Kingfisher should lay in a speech he made in Melbourne in 1947. Quote, "We had a complete plan for them," referring to Overall's battalion. "Our spies were in Japanese-held territory. We had established the necessary contacts with prisoners at Sandakan, and our parachute troops were going to relieve them. But at the moment we wanted to act, we couldn't get the necessary aircraft to take them in." Unquote. Blamey meant, of course, the necessary American aircraft to fly Colonel Overall's paratroopers in. MacArthur and SWPA possessed 600 Douglas DC-3 Dakota transport aircraft. If true, it looked pretty mealy-mouthed of the Americans not to have spared 34 Dakotas to fly in one battalion of troops to save hundreds, possibly several thousand Allied lives. Blamey's assertion is, however, hokum. There was no reason for the Australians to request American aircraft for Kingfisher. Even if the Americans had refused to assist with the operation, the declassification of the Kingfisher files in the 1970s revealed that the Royal Australian Air Force had 71 Dakotas based within easy range of Sandakan. As already noted, only 34 of these aircraft were required to transport Overall's assaulting parachute battalion of 800 men into Sandakan and rescue the prisoners. There was an additional source of aircraft available to the Australians, as SRD even possessed its own air wing, number 200 Flight RAAF. This Special Forces unit was used to drop personnel and supplies into Japanese-occupied territory and possessed 6 B-24 Liberator bombers. The figures for available aircraft, the state of readiness of Overall's battalion, and the excellent intelligence gleaned on Japanese troop numbers and prisoner locations all beggars the obvious question. Why was Kingfisher not given a green light? Lynette Ramsey Silver asserts that Kingfisher was cancelled because SRD had bungled. The organisation was not all it was cracked up to be. For example, for over 2 years, SRD had not realised that its operations inside Japanese-occupied Timor had been blown to the enemy, and they had continued to drop large amounts of supplies, including arms, ammunition and money, directly to the Japanese. 32 SRD operatives had been lost when they had parachuted straight into the clutches of the Kempe Tai, the Japanese military police. Silver had argued that a similar bungled operation was underway in Borneo when Kingfisher was dreamed up. Someone suspected a mess inside the Australian High Command and held off on Kingfisher long enough until the whole rescue operation was superseded by an Australian invasion of Borneo. This invasion was itself a vast sideshow and wasted effort. 2 Australian infantry divisions were committed to the operation, ordered by MacArthur. Whether the operation served any useful military purpose, unlike Kingfisher, continues to generate intense debate. Nominally, the invasion's objective was to secure the valuable oil fields of the Netherlands East Indies. but it was never realistic for these facilities to be operational in time to assist the American advance on Japan. The view was widely held that the only purpose of the operation was to keep other Allied forces off America's pitch for the last round of the Pacific War, writes Sir Max Hastings. Either way, on the 1st of May 1945, Australian troops invaded Tarakan and suffered 894 casualties by the end of July. On the 10th of June, the 9th Australian Division landed in Brunei Bay, and a further 114 were killed in action before the end of the month. On the 1st of July, the 7th Australian Division stormed ashore at Balikpapan in Dutch Borneo. In a week's fighting, 229 Australians were killed. Such casualty levels incurred to capture islands garrisoned by cut-off and starving Japanese appeared to many to be MacArthur's most cynical use of Australian forces in the war, and a damning indictment of how far the Americans were prepared to go to keep other nations out of the final victorious push on Japan. Quote, I happen to entertain the strongest possible view that it is wrong to use the Australian forces in operations which seem to me to have no relation to any first-class strategic object in this war, unquote, lamented opposition leader Robert Menzies in the Australian House of Representatives on the 26th of April 1945. MacArthur had ordered US forces in the region to maintain a passive stance against Japanese garrisons that were already cut off and isolated from the war, whereas General Blamey had volunteered Australian fighting divisions for what were in effect pointless mopping up operations in the Allied rear. Blamey defended his decision by claiming that, quote, the Australian government wished its troops to be seen to liberate territories under Australian colonial guardianship. This was a policy which might win some headlines, but was certain to cost lives, unquote. An equal amount of controversy surrounded and continues to surround Operation Kingfisher. For those who languished in the Sandakan POW camps or trekked the bloody trail to Ranau, any SRD incompetence surrounding the planning of Kingfisher was tantamount to a death sentence. Lieutenant Colonel Overall believed General Blamey's lie concerning the Americans refusing to release aircraft as the reason for Kingfisher's ultimate cancellation, and he was joined in this untruth by Athol Moffat, Allied prosecutor at the Labuan war crimes trials convened after the war to try those responsible for the Sandakan Death Marches. Major Chester, who commanded SRD operations in Borneo, rather let the cat out of the bag when he told a colleague just after the war, and who later wrote in his memoirs, quote, you know what they're going to do. Blamey's going to shift the blame for all of their bungling onto MacArthur, unquote. Unfortunately, Chester died of blackwater fever at Jesselton in August 1946 before he could challenge Blamey's post-war lie, and the person he told, Jack Wong Soo, was only a lowly sergeant in SRD and was in no position to contradict a general. Blamey's version of events quickly came to be viewed as the truth. Some writers have conjectured about the likely success of Kingfisher if SRD had got their act together and launched the rescue operation promptly. If the March rescue operation had gone ahead, well over 1,000 prisoners would still have been alive to be lifted out of Sandakan, writes one such historian, adding, with no serious Japanese opposition to be concerned about on the northeast coast, there were only about 1,500 troops, at the camp itself only a handful of guards. Unquote. Certainly, Colonel Overall's paratroopers would have made short work of the small Japanese forces remaining in the immediate vicinity of the Sandakan camps and would have rescued hundreds of men. One might argue that it was almost a war crime not to have launched Kingfisher when the opportunity was there, especially as those in the higher reaches of the Allied command were fully aware of what the Japanese were doing to British and Australian prisoners. One of the reasons why Kingfisher was cancelled, and then the cancellation blamed on the Americans, appears to have been to cover up the embarrassing incompetence of SRD operations in Borneo, which appear to have been as amateurish as those conducted in Timor. Faulty planning by SRD operatives was to blame, alongside higher echelon dithering. Another reason proposed by some historians has more to do with the suggestion that rescuing POWs was not an SRD priority. This theory certainly can hold some water. Planning for the invasion of North Borneo took precedence. Another possible reason for scrapping Kingfisher was a fear of failure. Historian Alan Powell has suggested that if the rescue attempt had been completely successful, the Japanese might have annihilated the remaining POWs in their hands in revenge, and to follow the orders to prevent the liberation of prisoners in their charge as issued by Tokyo. As it turned out, this particular argument is irrelevant, for the intention of the Japanese all along was to kill all of the prisoners that they held in the Sandakan camps. Whatever the true reason for the cancellation of Kingfisher, an opportunity was definitely missed for the Allies to have saved hundreds of lives. The assault forces were ready and trained to a high state. The aircraft were available, and the Australians knew where the prisoners were, their condition, and the strength of the Japanese forces guarding them. General Blamey must take the blame for his failure to act, and for his underhand and shameless attempt to shift the blame and responsibility for the dead of Sandakan onto General MacArthur. Although liberation never came for the men of Sandakan, the 6 surviving POWs, all Australians, were able to secure a modicum of justice for those who had been murdered. 8 Japanese, including Captain Susumi Hoshijima, the Sandakan camp's overall commandant, were found guilty of war crimes at the post-war trial and executed by hanging. A further 55 Japanese soldiers were found guilty of lesser counts of brutality and received terms of imprisonment. Lieutenant Colonel Tatsuji Suga, overall commander of the prison camp system on Borneo, managed to escape justice by committing suicide whilst in Australian captivity. He stabbed himself in the throat, and then his batman beat him to death with a water canteen half filled with sand. So ends the sad and distressing story of the Sandakan Death Marches. This series was researched, written and narrated by Dr. Mark Felton based on several of his published books. For short documentaries on a series of military history subjects, please visit my other YouTube channel, Mark Felton Productions. You can also help support both of my channels at PayPal and Patreon, details in the description box below.